Søren Kierkegaard was born on May 5, 1813, in Copenhagen, Denmark, into a wealthy and intellectually stimulating household. He was the youngest of 7 children born to Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, a retired merchant of Jutland peasant origin, and Anne Sørensdatter Lund. The Kierkegaard family resided in a modest yet well-appointed home at Nytorv 2, right in the heart of the Danish capital, a cultural and political center of early 19th century Denmark. His father, Michael, was a deeply religious and philosophical man, known for his intense introspection and somber view of life, which had a profound impact on the household atmosphere. The family's wealth, gained through Michael's success in business, allowed Søren a privileged upbringing that included private tutors and access to classical education. However, the home was also marked by a strict Lutheran piety and a heavy sense of guilt and melancholy, sentiments that surrounded young Søren from an early age. Tragically, several of Kierkegaard's siblings died in childhood, and his mother passed away when he was just 21. These early encounters with loss and mortality cast a long shadow over his formative years, saturating his home life with spiritual gravity and melancholic introspection. Yet amid this somber atmosphere, young Kierkegaard developed a razor-sharp wit and a keen sense of irony. Some interpret this irony as a defense mechanism, a way to distance himself from the pervasive gloom of his upbringing, while others see it as the early spark of a deeply reflective mind, instinctively probing the paradoxes of human existence. Either way, this combination of sorrow, intellect, and biting humor became a defining trait of his philosophical voice. Copenhagen, during Kierkegaard's youth, was a modest yet intellectually vibrant city, pulsing with cultural life centered around the University of Copenhagen and Denmark's flourishing literary scene. Although the country had faced economic collapse following the state bankruptcy and national trauma of the British bombardment in 1807, the city remained a hub for academic and philosophical discourse. It was in this environment that Kierkegaard began his theology studies in 1830. However, he soon grew disillusioned with the rigid formalism of academic life. To him, the university lacked authenticity. It was too abstract, too disconnected from the lived experience of existence. This aversion led him to avoid taking exams, but his time at the university nonetheless profoundly influenced his philosophical development. Rather than immersing himself in lectures, Kierkegaard spent his days wandering through the parks of Copenhagen, lost in thought, slowly nurturing the existential ideas that would later define his authorship. He was known to enjoy the company of both boisterous theology students and reflective elderly companions, often frequenting the cafes and taverns scattered across the city. In his famous journal, Kierkegaard vividly recounts his many conversations with people from all walks of Copenhagen life, conversations that no doubt fed his fascination with the human condition. The sensation is universal, a pounding heart, a racing pulse, and an overwhelming fear of the unknown. At the same time, there's an inexplicable desire to confront that unknown, to make it known, no matter the cost. This is the essence of anxiety, a feeling that has long been recognized as part of the human experience. Naturally, the question arises, why does anxiety exist in the first place? Evolutionary theory suggests that traits persist when they serve a survival advantage, yet anxiety doesn't seem to fit this model. It doesn't react to immediate, tangible threats. That's fear's domain. It doesn't strengthen social bonds, nor does it lead to productive or strategic thought. On the surface, anxiety appears to serve no practical function other than to stir mental unrest and emotional turmoil. Despite this, anxiety undeniably plays a significant role in human life. It has been explored extensively in literature, philosophy, and psychology, and has influenced countless human narratives. Its paradox lies in being so deeply woven into our existence while seeming, at times, devoid of practical purpose. If evolutionary theory falls short of explaining its presence, we must turn to other interpretations. Søren Kierkegaard provides one such interpretation in his work from 1844, Begrebet, Angest, the concept of anxiety. Here, Kierkegaard delves into anxiety not as a simple physiological response, but as an existential condition. He argues that anxiety is rooted in the human soul's unique ability to reflect, not just on the concrete, but on the abstract, the unknown.
Angsten afspejles i menneskets åndelige element, og det er ligeledes derfor mennesket abstraherer fra jordens fauna, i det vores bevidsthed tillader os ikke kun at forholde os til vores eksistens, men ligeledes det ukendte og det ukonkrete.
For Kierkegaard, anxiety emerges as a byproduct of human freedom, a consequence of the infinite possibilities that freedom presents.
Angsten er et biprodukt af frihedens muligheder, der skabes grundet det ukendte.
Unlike fear, which is grounded in immediate, specific dangers, anxiety arises from the vast, undefined realm of possibility. While reality is concrete and immediate, possibilities are endless, intangible, and often beyond our grasp. Fertile ground for anxiety to flourish. This idea is vividly illustrated by Kierkegaard's example of the hypochondriac.
Hypokondere kan således ikke forholde sig til det ukendte i forhold til, hvornår eller hvilken sygdom vil indtræffe. Det medfører angst, i det åndens selvreflektion vil blive trodset.
The hypochondriac doesn't suffer from a physical illness, but from the mere possibility of it. This uncertainty, the unknown, fuels anxiety. Only when the illness becomes real, when the unknown is replaced with a concrete diagnosis, can the individual begin to confront it without fear of endless, unresolvable possibilities.
Det er således først, når sygdommen indtræder, at det ukendte fjernes, og hypokonderen således kan forholde sig til virkeligheden frem for de ængstede muligheder.
Kierkegaard's insight offers a compelling explanation for the rising anxiety in modern society. With globalization, democratization, and technological advances, individuals today face a constant barrage of choices and freedoms, new possibilities at every turn. While these opportunities empower, they also breed uncertainty, making anxiety about potential futures often more intense than the fear of actual threats. Kierkegaard's analysis reveals anxiety as a natural byproduct of human freedom and self-awareness. Rather than being a flaw or weakness, it is an intrinsic part of our consciousness, the result of our ability to imagine, to reflect, and to make choices. In this light, anxiety is not something to be avoided or eradicated, but something to be understood as a fundamental aspect of what it means to be human. It is, in essence, an unavoidable consequence of our freedom to create and define ourselves. If anxiety, as Kierkegaard outlines in The Concept of Anxiety, is the dizziness of freedom, the internal unrest born from standing before the infinite possibilities of selfhood, then it is precisely this existential unease that becomes the catalyst for movement through life's stages. Anxiety reveals to the individual that existence is not something fixed, but something that must be chosen over and over again. It forces us to confront not just what we are, but what we might become. This confrontation is what initiates the journey through what Kierkegaard calls stages on life's way. This concept was introduced in Kierkegaard's later works and officially published in 1845. These stages represent not mere psychological types, but existential postures, different ways in which the self can relate to itself, to others, and to God. While Kierkegaard sometimes refers to them as stages of development, he also calls them existence spheres, emphasizing that they are not always passed through in a linear fashion. An individual may inhabit multiple stages at once, but one always dominates. The first of these is the stage of the Philistine, or the Spitzberger. This is the person who never truly confronts the anxiety of existence. He lives in conformity, adapting uncritically to social norms and expectations. He works, marries, raises children, and discusses what one discusses. But he has not chosen this life. He simply follows the script handed to him. He is asleep to himself. Eventually, anxiety breaks through. The Philistine begins to feel that something is missing. In response, he may retreat into the aesthetic stage, becoming the aesthete. The aesthete seeks to avoid existential responsibility by immersing himself in pleasure, novelty, or intellectual games. He constructs a life of surface-level satisfaction where nothing is truly binding. But this too collapses because he cannot avoid himself. The aesthete begins to experience despair, a crushing emptiness that no pleasure can mask. Kierkegaard captures this most famously in his own voice. Writing in a journal from his youth, "I come home from a party where I was the life of the evening, witty and admired, and then I want to shoot myself." This is the moment when irony appears, a detachment from the aesthetic life and a hint of the ethical awakening. Irony is the threshold between the aesthetic and the ethical. In the ethical stage, the individual embraces responsibility. He no longer hides behind distractions, but chooses to live with seriousness and commitment. Kierkegaard stresses that what matters is not whether we always choose rightly, but how we choose, with energy, passion, and inwardness. The ethical person chooses himself. He accepts his identity, his limits, his environment, and his moral obligations. Outwardly, he may resemble the Philistine, working, marrying, raising children. But unlike the Philistine, the ethical person has made a conscious, passionate choice. Yet even here, anxiety does not disappear. Eventually, the ethical self discovers its limits. It realizes that no matter how responsibly one lives, one cannot fully redeem oneself. Here, the religious stage begins. The first form is religiousness, A, the recognition that the self stands in relation to an infinite, eternal power, God. This stage brings with it an overwhelming sense of guilt, not legal guilt, but existential guilt. Before God, we are always in the wrong, Kierkegaard writes. This acknowledgement does not lead to despair, but to humility, to the realization that God's love is greater than our failure. Religiousness, A, leads to religiousness, B, specifically Christian faith. Here, the paradox is embraced that the eternal God became a human being in time. The individual now relates to the divine, not through reason, but through passionate belief in the absurd. One accepts that one is a sinner, not just guilty, but forgiven through Christ. This is the stage of highest inwardness, where the self becomes fully itself only by surrendering to something greater. For Kierkegaard, to be religious is to take a leap of faith into the unknown, what he calls the 70,000 fathoms of uncertainty. Faith, then, is not built on certainty, but on the decision to believe despite it. The religious individual must live with doubt, constantly revisiting and reaffirming their commitment to belief. Faith is not a static possession, but an ongoing act of existential courage. In The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard expands this existential psychology, writing that the self is composed of 3 levels: the cellar, the living room, and the first floor, an image of layered consciousness that would later echo in Freud's model of the unconscious, preconscious, and conscious mind. Kierkegaard's influence thus stretches far beyond philosophy, shaping existentialist thought across Europe in the 20th century and leaving an indelible mark on modern psychology. But at its core, his message is not abstract, it is existential. The stages on life's way are not distant theories, but choices we each face. At every moment, anxiety may confront us with the freedom to change, and it is through our response that we become who we are.